Right, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Dimas Ramprasad Post-Budget Forum, which is put on by the Department of Economics here at the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine. We have an exciting afternoon for you as the Post-Budget Forum, one of the few, if not only, all-academic post-budget forum that is always featured every year, and we feature every year after the budget is presented. As we know, the Minister of Finance, the Honorable Minister of Finance, presented the budget on Monday. And so we have had some time to look over the budget. The economists on the panel this afternoon have all had an opportunity to delve deeper into the budget that was presented. And so we will get some rich discussion this afternoon. So again, welcome to the Dimas Ramprasad Post-Budget Forum hosted by the Department of Economics. We welcome you this afternoon. We're happy to have you with us. My name is Daren, Conrad, and I will be the host for this afternoon. I am the head of the Department of Economics, and so again, I will be with you until the end of this afternoon's proceedings. We will have the panelists present. Each panelist will present for 20 minutes, and then we will entertain the questions, which will be directed to the panelists. During the course of the presentations, you may post your questions or comments throughout the presentations in the chat. When you are posting in the chat, please remember to post to all recipients or all participants so that we can all be able to see the questions and the comments. Again, welcome. And this afternoon, we have with us in order of presentation, we have Professor Emeritus Patrick Watson, Dr. Dave Seerattan, and Dr. Vaalmikki Arjoon. I will introduce all of the panelists and then they will begin their presentations. And I'm simply going to ask that when one panelist is finished, you can indicate that you will now pass on to the next panelist. Again, you have 20 minutes. At the, let's say, 18-minute mark, I will indicate to you as we are doing this virtually, there's no pretty way of indicating subtly to you that you have 3 or 4 minutes left. So you will hear me button and say you have 3 more minutes left. That's the prettiest we can do it, but that's the best we can. So with us again, we have in order of presentation, Professor Patrick Watson, no stranger to us, no stranger to Trinidad and Tobago. Professor Emeritus Patrick Watson, he served at the university until September 2017, when he retired as Professor of Applied Economics and University Director at the Sir Arthur Lewis Institute of Social and Economic Studies. He was also the Dean of the Faculty of Social Sciences. He has his academic training is in mathematical economics and econometrics. Professor Emeritus Patrick Watson also served as chairman of the Trinidad and Tobago Securities and Exchange Commission, chairman of the Northwest Regional Health Authority, deputy chairman of the Regulated Industries Commission, director of the Central Bank, and a member of the board of directors of International Organization of Securities Commissions. He specializes and is published widely in empirical studies related to the Caribbean economy. So we welcome Professor Emeritus Patrick Watson. I will next introduce Dr. Dave Seerattan. Dr. Dave Seerattan is an economist studying Caribbean and emerging economies. He has been doing so for over 20 years, and he specializes in the financial sector in these economies. So we expect to hear some rich discussion on what is happening with our foreign exchange, because of course, he has researched the microstructure, financial market microstructure, global foreign exchange markets, mutual fund performance in the Caribbean, fiscal reforms in the Caribbean, and business strategy and competitiveness in the Caribbean. He's also a consultant in the areas of financial market development, regulatory systems for the financial sector. He now teaches international money and finance at the graduate level at the Institute of International Relations here at the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine campus. He also headed the Caribbean Center for Money and Finance from 2015 to 2017 and served as editor of the Journal of Business, Finance and Economics in Emerging Economies. Dr. Dave Seerattan, thank you for joining us this afternoon, and we look forward to hearing from you based on your wealth of experience. And last but not least, we have Dr. Vaalmikki Arjoon, who is a lecturer at the University of the West Indies. He lectures in finance and economics and business statistics at the Department of Management Studies and at the Arthur Lockjack Global School of Business. Prior to joining UE, he was a lecturer in financial and macroeconomics at the University of Nottingham in the United Kingdom. and their campus in Ningbo, China. He also received his PhD and MSc degrees in financial economics from the University of Nottingham. He currently serves on the Council of Institute of Banking and Finance in Trinidad and Tobago, and he plays a key role in promoting professional education in the local banking and finance sector. He's also a member of several professional international economics associations, including the Royal Economic Society. Apart from that, he is a regular commentator, and I'm sure you would have seen him during the course of this week gone here, and so far, on economic and financial matters in the local mainstream media. He's also published much of his research in highly respected international peer-reviewed journals in the area of finance and macroeconomics. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Arjoon, this afternoon. So without further ado, with this experienced panel, I will not take away from what they will be commenting on. And again, we will take your questions in the chat during the course of the presentation, your comments and questions. So without further ado, Professor Watson, over to you.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Are you hearing me? Yes, thank you very much, Chairman, and thanks for the introduction. I am hoping that you're hearing me and that I haven't fouled up on the technology.
I'm hearing you.
Yeah, I am going to do a little presentation, which I'm going to put up on the screen now. So you'll be seeing largely that during the discussion. And I want to do this in such a way because I don't want you shouting at me when the time comes, but please feel free to do so when it does happen. As it turns out, I will be speaking largely about foreign exchange because I think it's the major policy concern of Trinidad and Tobago, since without it, everything grinds to a halt. In fact, this concern is addressed in the 2021 budget. So I will be looking at the measures that were taken, not all because I simply don't have the time. And I would ask the question if this would stem the hemorrhaging, because that is the main concern, or will it result in even further hemorrhaging? There was also some emphasis placed on growth, but I want the audience to understand that we can have growth in this country. It's not going to be sustainable, but that growth can be foreign exchange depleting, and it's something that we have to be concerned about. I am also going to attempt, with some trepidation, some understanding of what we can do to earn foreign exchange, especially from activity not related to the energy sector. Let me start by saying a few words on the state of foreign exchange reserves as it is. It has been depleting at a relatively rapidly rate since, certainly from 2015, but probably even from before. And we went from about 11 billion to 7 billion in 2020. 11 billion in 2015, that's US dollars, but of that 7 billion, 2 billion is borrowed money. There was recently some fairly large borrowing. So technically we have a net amount of 5 billion in foreign reserves, official foreign reserves. The HSB, the Heritage and Stabilization Fund, has held roughly at about 6 billion over the same period. So we have a stock of about 13 billion to play with. I don't mean that literally, because it's not something to play with. And it's it's US 11 billion if we ignore the borrowed funds. So you see, I'm tying up the Heritage and Stabilization Fund, which some people will want to crucify me for. What I'm doing that just for the sake of arithmetic more than anything else. My own calculation is that this will probably last for another 5 years given the current rate, because I even expect the current rate to speed up a little bit as things happen if we start reaching the point of no return. And I'm hoping that we have enough time. We really don't. We should have been doing this kind of thing, what I'm going to talk about since even before I was born, and I'm probably the oldest member. I am the oldest member on this panel. So we are going to see what can be done. The minister has pinned a lot of hope on the manufacturing sector. This is not new. If you know the history, the economic history of Trinidad and Tobago, and indeed of the region, this goes back to the 1950s following the work of Arthur Lewis. And there was a large amount of effort put into the development of the manufacturing sector as earners of foreign exchange, using imported capital and all of that. And most of you will know that that policy, which is what was eventually termed derogatively by Lloyd Best as industrialization by invitation, it did not work, and the manufacturing sector did not achieve the goal of becoming a major foreign exchange earner. In fact, a lot of the records show that they were foreign exchange users. I put a few quotes there. I'm not going to go through all of them because it would eat into my time, but I like the first one, that the minister sees that the manufacturing sector as the digital catalyst. That's a fancy word that is introduced into this or developed a lot, digitalization and even digitization. The digital catalyst for achieving economic transformation and diversification. When we speak diversification in Trinidad and Tobago, and I expect that the minister understands that we speak foreign exchange earning activity. We're not just talking about going into a product that we can buy and sell if it is foreign exchange using. In fact, every time I use the word diversification in the context of a country like Trinidad and Tobago, which does not have a hard currency, I am speaking of a good or a service or both that generates foreign exchange. I'm going to let you read the others, but I'm going to move on. Now, over the years, Trinidad and Tobago has become the most successful manufacturing sector in the CARICOM and probably the Caribbean. We dominate the CARICOM region, that is for sure. Some competition from Jamaica, but we are around. And that is no surprise, in fact, given the emphasis that was placed on it as far back as the 1950s. Now, although many people have become rich from the manufacturing sector, it has remained a net user of foreign exchange. They do export. It is a very successful exporter in the CARICOM region. Even outside of the CARICOM region, I've seen some of our goods and services in countries like Martinique and Guadeloupe and others. So how do we overcome this, manufacturing sector, which is a large employer, but a foreign exchange user? And you have to understand that once you are using foreign exchange and you're not really adding to the stock, you're running into an unsustainable problem. In fact, I'm going to argue, but very, very quickly later on in the discussion, and I hope I get time for questions on it, that all the other sectors identified, that includes tourism, agriculture, the creative and industries, they all are users of foreign exchange, and they are not, they are very often net users. The minister had some nice sounding phrases. I'm only going to repeat the first one. He emphasized the deficiencies and structural rigidities within the manufacturing sector. I'm not sure which ones he's talking about, and he's saying that they will be addressed. There's a lot of what I would call vacuous words in the budget. I don't mean that to be naughty to the minister, but they make statements that are not backed up by any hard evidence or anything like that. So we are being flattered in a way into believing certain things that may not come to pass. And in fact, if anything, is that all the administrations in this country have been very, very long on fancy words, on seductive words, but very often short on delivery. So there are a few more things that they're saying that will happen with the economic free zone. I can go into some of these later on. But one of the fears I have is some of these things will not come to pass. Now, the manufacturing sector is as good a bet as any in my view. They have the experience in markets, largely CARICOM. They are not very, very strong outside, except for one or two of them. They have used the CARICOM very, very well. The problem with that is that if the CARICOM countries, which are largely tourist-based, have any difficulties, our manufacturing sector suffers deliberately. So if this manufacturing sector is to succeed, it must be seeking outlets beyond CARICOM, you see, and that is not going to be an easy task. So in the short to medium term, there is no problem in using foreign exchange reserves if we build, as is the promise, a capacity to earn further foreign exchange, which is the only sustainable solution. My own feeling is that this will not happen unless there's a dramatic change in the way the manufacturing sector does business, which is based on the use of foreign exchange earned in other sectors, principally the energy sector, I should say, in the other sector, and making Trinidad and Tobago dollar profits on that basis. That's a serious problem. The most extreme form of that is the retail sector, which doesn't generate any foreign exchange at all, takes the foreign exchange earned by other sectors, buys goods and services, sells it to us, and then converts that money back into foreign exchange to sell to us. Again, that is very, very foreign exchange using, and not in any way foreign exchange contributing. What we want are contributors. What we want to develop are sectors that contribute. So you have to say that the proposed measures may contribute to the revival. Well, it doesn't really need any great reviving, but it can make it stronger, the manufacturing sector. The measures proposed, for instance, the amount of discretionary income, disposable income put into the hands of people, will contribute to increased employment, will contribute to the growth of the sector, and even contribute to overall growth as it is measured, as it is. But all of this may be at the cost of foreign exchange reserves, which is not sustainable. And we have to bear that in mind. Going very quickly, the other sectors with a potential for foreign exchange earning mentioned in the budget are the tourism sector. Other sectors are mentioned there, but these are clearly ones that they talk about. I wouldn't have the time to go into detail, but I hope when the questions come, because this is largely for the audience. The agricultural sector, two of the ones that are already widely touted. I want to mention that at this point in time, the tourism sector contributes about 4% of GDP and probably less, and the agricultural sector less than 1%. And of course, the third sector always in view is the ever faithful energy sector. Let me deal with the last first, because there seems to be an unwillingness to let go of this sector. And don't get me wrong, we must not let go of a cash cow if it is there, but we must not depend on this to turn things around for us. In the budget, the minister promised that the current account will be in surplus by 2022 due to increasing energy exports and stabilizing imports. I am not sure where the evidence for this, for both parts of it, increasing the energy exports and stabilizing imports, I'm not too sure where the evidence for that comes from. And this is a very weighty promise. And by the way, especially given the current conditions, which is COVID and the difficulties of our neighbors to settle down and redevelop their tourism sectors, the tourism sector is in danger all around the world. Incidentally, a similar promise about the energy sector turning us around, so to speak, was also made in the last budget. There are many repetitions, in fact, in this budget. And even when that was made, in the absence of any knowledge of COVID-19 in October 2019, I had serious doubts about this because there was no compelling evidence. And I continue to have doubts now, and I will explain why very, very quickly. We have been witnessing production declines in the energy sector for some time now. And the old 100,000 barrels, which I used to boast about when I was a child, that is now in the past. In fact, we have been hitting about 60,000 barrels. The gas is also diminishing. The prices are not good. But I would like to say that even if prices rise, given the levels of production that we now have, we are not going to be able to take full advantage of it. We seem to be unable to let go. That happens. There is something called cognitive dissonance in a form, as many people continue to believe that the oil and gas will already come around to say, but it may, but we must not count on it. And in fact, this is the reason for some of the points made by the minister in his contribution and being made by me at this point in time. I am going to run out of time, so I'm going to tell you that I have my doubts about depending on the tourism and agricultural sector. and I will only deal with them very, very briefly here, but you should know that these sectors are also dependent on the use of foreign exchange in their production processes. So whereas people will come and spend money in a hotel, the hotel itself uses a lot of foreign exchange. And in the case of Tobago tourism, it's a frightening thing that most of the tourism in Tobago is from Trinidad. In fact, I have been told it's close to 80, even as high as 90%. And that is not foreign exchange, that is not foreign exchange earning. In the case of the agricultural sector, I sincerely want the agriculture and the tourism sector to be developed. I am not saying this because I don't want them to be. I am saying that we should be very careful about depending on them in any meaningful way. And I would certainly like people to define what is meant by food security, because most people believe that it would be, if some tragedy should take place in the world, that we will be able to feed ourselves without depending on the residue. That will never happen. I want you to understand that. I could develop on that as we go ahead. And whereas we can do more to make ourselves a little bit, we can immunize ourselves more, it's just not going to. Mention was made of something that I have been studying recently, of the creative and cultural industries. And that includes event and festival tourism like Carnival and other things. They have their limitations, which I will not develop here. One of the limitations is that these depend a lot on individuals like a Marshall Montano, who may make money from his soca singing activity, but that foreign exchange may not come here unless other conditions change radically, such as, for instance, the crime, such as he must have confidence to bring his foreign exchange, his earned foreign exchange here. I also would want to deal, because we have studied Carnival in Antigua and Barbuda, and there is we found no evidence of it being foreign exchange earning or even being profitable. I think if we do a serious study of Carnival here, I know some have been done, but I've questioned the methodology involved in them. We may see that if Carnival is a foreign exchange earner at all, it is going to be very, very marginal, and it may even be a foreign exchange, a net user of foreign exchange. And I could speak of what leads me to those speculations. So what can be done? This is going to be a bit of an anticlimax, because in a way I cannot point to any one sector that I feel will work. And I think what we need to do is to produce and sell any legally acceptable good, and that includes very soon marijuana, and perhaps especially services that will be a successful foreign exchange earner. Now, at this point in time, that good or service may not even be on our radar. That is the important point. What I think we have to stop doing is believing that because something appears to be a low-hanging fruit, like agriculture, and it appears to be, but we don't think it through when we talk about it. And I'm speaking about, in particular, about traditional tourism, and I could develop on this in the question time. They need not at all be low-hanging fruit. I heard Terence Farrell say a few days ago that we have to be prepared to climb or to use a rod to get some of the food that we're talking about. It's not going to be easy. So I am thinking of, and this is something that should have been done a long time ago when we had the money, because it's going to be costly. But I'm going to argue that it can still be done, but there's some risks. The risks are going to become a little bit more expensive. We need to look for appropriate goods and services by spending money on innovation. We have been studying this at the SALISES, on financing entrepreneurship, even while simultaneously concentrating on our ostensibly safe bets, the ostensibly low-hanging fruit. This is a risky and a costly business. Ask any successful entrepreneur like Elon Musk, and they will tell you how expensive innovation and entrepreneurship, and in particular will likely be costly in terms of foreign exchange. So what do we have? I showed you earlier that we have a stock of about 13 billion US, which includes the HSB. And it is something that we can use to this effect. There are risks involved there. And we have to be mindful that when we are doing certain things, we may fail at it. We cannot win with everyone. I am hoping that there is enough time to stem this hemorrhaging and find a source other than the energy sector. Now, the longer we take to do this, the more painful the adjustment is going to be. In fact, we are already starting to see some of the pain. The minister made certain recommendations which resemble the epoch of the 1970s and 80s, where we had the negative list and we had bans on certain kinds of imports. We had, when we are traveling, to fill out forms. The younger people, I'm seeing these pretty young faces in front of me, they may not know of these kinds of things. They may not, unless they have read the history of it. Before 1993, we were unable to travel without filling out certain forms and going to the bank and getting money and so on. I want to insist that expanding demand, I saw this in the Roadmap to Recovery report, I saw it in the budget. By generating growth, by expanding demand, leads inevitably, directly and indirectly, to demand pressures on foreign exchange, no matter what sector you're talking about. You may see growth in the economy, you may see certain sectors expanding based on it, but it is because they are using foreign exchange, which they are not replacing. And that is a dangerous problem that we are having. We are likely to find that as we go on and we get closer and closer to the day of reckoning, we are going to see some adjustments like exchange rate depreciation. It's not that the minister is going to come and announce it. That kind of day is gone. The central bank will simply cease to back up the foreign exchange as it does now, and the rate will largely separate. There will be physical limitation on imports, as we are seeing now. There's some report on cars and so on. And there may be increased foreign exchange rationing more than we are seeing at this point in there. We don't want to reach to that point. And as I say, expanding demand, for instance, by making me have more disposable income and so on, ask the IMF about this, and this inevitably leads to current account crises, because our appetite for foreign goods and services is very, very big. And any increase in demand inevitably means an increase in demand for goods and services that have foreign content, either directly or indirectly through our demand for goods produced by our manufacturing sector. I want to say, in guise of conclusion, a little statement from Peter Drucker, one of the gurus of entrepreneurial activity. And this is what my discussion wanted to be. The greatest danger in times of turbulence is not turbulence itself, but to act with yesterday's logic. And if we continue to act with yesterday's logic, which is what I am seeing in this budget when we go to the tourism sector, the agriculture sector. Thank you very much. I now pass to my younger, more esteemed colleague, my former student, Dave Seerattan.
Thank you, Professor Watson. I hope everyone is hearing me. All right. First, I want to thank the Department of Economics for both organizing this very interesting and important budget review, as well as to thank them for inviting me once again to be a panelist. I also want to preface my presentation by saying that this budget is pivotal in the context of it being delivered in the midst of a pandemic that has had unprecedented impact on the global economy and indeed on our country, probably a bigger negative impact than we had since independence, including the international financial crisis of 2007-2008. So it's in that context, this budget is very important in the sense that it lays out and the tone that the government is going to adopt, not only in getting us out of the immediate crisis, but in terms of planning for the future ahead, which is, as Professor Watson indicated, there are many, many challenges. Okay, so I want to share my screen so that people could follow the presentation. Okay, thank you. And basically what I will try to cover, because as Professor Watson indicated, it's very difficult to deal with all the issues in a 20-minute presentation. So much of what I say is going to be highly summary, and I'll try to focus on some of the main issues that I think we need to address and have some commentary in terms of what the minister proposed on Monday during the budget presentation. Okay, so I'm going to try to talk a little bit about COVID-19 and the unprecedented nature of the shock that we are facing. I'm going to talk about some of the budget assumptions and the strategy, whether it's appropriate or not. And of course, like Professor Watson, I'm going to offer my 2 cents in terms of what the minister can do additionally to address the situation that we face now and going forward. The first point I want to make is that this particular year is very unprecedented in terms of the COVID-19 pandemic. It's unprecedented in modern times in terms of the scale, in terms of the unique nature of the crisis, because the crisis, as everyone would have noticed, has psychological impact, which has manifested itself in extreme risk aversion that has impacted negatively on certain sectors. We could talk about tourism, we could talk about air travel, but it also has had some significant negative impact on the financial sector around the world. So that added complexity of this particular period is going to provide more complex challenges to the government. And of course, in the midst of all this, there has been unprecedented policies in terms of lockdown costs, government expenditure during the crisis, and of course, the moral obligation of governments to support groups dislocated by the lockdown. Because as someone pointed out recently, this crisis is unprecedented in nature because a lot of the economic fallout from the crisis has actually been caused by the government's need to lock down the economy and in many cases disrupt the earning ability of a whole range of groups in the society. So in that context, one has to say that you have to have, the government has a moral obligation to provide financial support. And of course, we cannot talk about the budget in any one of these Caribbean countries, small and open as they are, without talking about what we expect for the global economy. And the IMF has projected that the global economy is going to contract by 3% this year, recovering to about 5.8% in 2021. But of course, those forecasts are subject to a high level of uncertainty. This so-called V-shaped recovery has been disputed by many economists across the world, and a lot of them actually said that there's going to be a U-shaped recovery, which implies that we are not going to recover next year. It's probably going to take a little longer than that for the global economy, and therefore the economic fortune of Trinidad and Tobago to recover. In Trinidad and Tobago, we expect, the IMF has forecast that the growth is going to be negative 4.5% this year, improving to 2.6% in 2021. But of course, this is contingent on what happens with the global economy and what happens with commodity prices and so on. And of course, as Professor Watson pointed out, there are many idiosyncratic factors that also restrain growth in Trinidad and Tobago. So he mentioned what some of the challenges in the energy sector. He mentioned some of the structural deficiencies and vulnerabilities that we have in our economy. He mentioned, of course, he focused on the import intensity and the related imbalances in the foreign exchange market that generates as significant challenges that we need to address. And of course, those things have been partially addressed by the minister. Of course, the forecast of a 2.6% rebound in 2021 is somewhat optimistic because that assumed that there wasn't going to be a major second wave of infections. And as we have seen all around the world, as soon as countries open up their borders and relax restrictions and so on, the infections rate went up and countries had to lock down their borders and sectors again, which meant that, of course, growth was going to fall off again, right? So a lot of what is going to happen in the future depends not only on how the global economy evolves, but it's also going to be affected by how our government responds. And it is that context that this budget is so critical, because it will set the tone for the response to one of the greatest threats to Trinidad and Tobago's development in the post-independence period. So this is a major inflection point in our nation's development. In terms of the budget assumptions and strategies, the assumption of our oil price of $45 a barrel and gas at $3 per MMBTU, on the face of it seems reasonable. That means that we expect revenues to be about roughly 41.4 billion, and expenditure to be 49.6 billion in the current financial year, which equates to 8.26 billion deficit, or 5.6% as a percentage of GDP. The budgeted oil price is slightly optimistic, since most forecasts put the price of oil about $35 a barrel in 2020 and US $42 a barrel in 2021. And as has been pointed out to me, if we take in the price of Brent, we normally get about $3 to $4 less because of the quality of the oil that we produce. So it is somewhat optimistic, at least on the oil price benchmark, that is slightly optimistic. So that means there is all likelihood that we may not attain the level of revenues that the minister is expecting, and therefore, of course, the fiscal deficit is going to be necessarily larger, and of course, we're going to have a greater challenge and more help in terms of the deficit financing that we're going to need. In terms of the overall strategy, I think the overall strategy to maintain spending at approximately 50 billion and try to close revenue shortfalls by higher taxes, as well as a more efficient tax administration system in the form of the Revenue Authority is the way to go, since the economy seems to have reached the limit where further cuts in expenditure would be counterproductive for growth and overall welfare. So I think the minister have basically, over the last 4 years, have cut expenditure down to the bone, and going further in that direction is going to be counterproductive, not only for growth, but for welfare and poverty levels and so on in the society, which is going to create an environment where it's going to be very difficult to get the economy growing strongly again after the pandemic passes and so on. So the minister has to be very careful in terms of how he goes about trying to meet the challenges that he faces. And I think it's the right approach to basically put a halt to the cuts in expenditure that have happened over the last 3 to 4 years, and focus more on closing the fiscal deficit with revenue by trying to increase revenues through a variety of means. The move to add incentives to the SME sector, as well as construction and the housing sector, is also a move in the right directions, since if anybody who has been following how economies grow and so on, understand that these sectors normally lead in the growth cycles. So you want to prime those sectors that lead in the growth cycle, so that when the pandemic passes, you can quickly get up to steam in terms of getting the economy going and so on. So I think that in terms of strategy, that is indeed the right way to proceed. Very importantly, and Professor Watson touched on this, the decision not to use the exchange rate at this time, very importantly, he mentioned at this time, to drive the adjustment is the right decision, since such a move is subject to high downside risk, may not work as intended, as most of us who have worked on foreign exchange markets in the Caribbean know. The textbook indication of how exchange rate changes will work often don't work as planned in our types of economies, and they could actually generate perverse results for growth and would introduce an added level of complexities, making the adjustment process more difficult. And let me explain what I mean by that. Right now, the minister is basically fighting on two fronts. He has fiscal problems in terms of a revenue shortfall relative to expenditure, and he's also trying to reinvigorate growth, right? But if you allow the exchange rate to go, as some people are suggesting, then the minister is going to have to fight on three fronts. Because as anyone who knows the economic history of the Caribbean, that once people lose confidence and so on in difficult economic times, it is very difficult for the monetary authorities to control where the exchange rate goes. Okay? So I could bet any amount of money that the minister will be much happier fighting on 2 fronts rather than on 3 fronts. And there are a variety of reasons why exchange rate based adjustment do not work in economies like ours. In the first case, exchange rate adjustment tends to be effective in decreasing imports and increasing government revenues because we collect revenues in US dollars from our energy companies. And when you convert it, obviously if it's 20 to 1 rather than 6.7993 to 1, the government gets more TT dollars which it could spend and so on. But that is a relatively hollow victory because, as someone pointed out, almost immediately unions and a whole host of stakeholders are going to demand increases in wages and so on to combat what is going on with inflation and so on. So yes, it does decrease imports, but there are a multiplicity of different policy measures that one could use if you wanted to decrease imports, some of which the minister have actually started doing. You might argue about the effectiveness of these policy measures, but there are many other approaches one can use if you want to decrease imports to deal with our balance of payments deficit. But some of the other things that happens when you have foreign exchange, when you make exchange rate changes to deal with reforms and so on, and we should know this by now, you generally do not see an increase in imports because our import prices, our export prices, and our exports in general tend to be very inelastic. So the price goes up, goes down, it generally does not change much the quantity demanded from the rest of the world. So for example, a lot of our energy exports are on long-term contracts at fixed prices with people who, with our consumers where they are in the world. So the change in the exchange rate is not really going to make a material difference to the level of demand for our energy products. So again, that is something that is not really going to work in Trinidad and Tobago. Very importantly, it is, of all the studies done in the Caribbean, it has shown that exchange rate devaluations, depreciations, whatever you want to call it, it increases income equality with negative consequences for growth. Because a lot of the new research coming out of the World Bank and the IMF have actually shown that increasing inequality actually causes growth to fall, right? So you have to be very careful that you do not put in place policies that could have perverse results for growth and for welfare generally in the economy. Very importantly, the psychological and behavioral economic aspects of exchange rate changes and foreign exchange market would set in train speculative pressures, and the monetary authorities tend in these situations not be able to are not able to control the trajectory for the rate. If you want to, you don't have to look very far. Just look at the monetary history of Guyana and Jamaica, right? The Jamaican exchange rate used to be 7.75 Jamaican cents to $1 US back in the early days after independence in Jamaica. It is now at an astronomical rate that I am sure that the people who initiate the policy of devaluation in those Holicon days never expected the rate to reach those levels. And of course, it has had a serious negative impact on not only welfare, but growth as well in Jamaica and in Guyana. It will also damage confidence in Trinidad and Tobago denominated financial assets and increase the substitution of US financial assets for TT financial assets, accentuating the imbalances in the foreign exchange market and increasing pressure on the exchange rate. So it is likely to have very perverse results to what was anticipated, right? So another negative consequence of these kinds of changes is that perverse and overly risky investment activities by individuals trying to protect the value of their wealth holdings could lead to very risky investments in real estate speculation, for example, or other exotic instruments such as the pyramid schemes that we have been hearing a lot about in the news today. So a lot of what you do with the exchange rate generates all these perverse results that could actually lead to bigger problems than you had in the first place. And of course, it could also cause financial instability and growing demonetization of the formal financial system, which has a whole set of negative consequences flowing from those kinds of things. And many studies have also shown that in many countries, the exchange rate devaluation, while it may deal with lowering imports and increasing the domestic dollar revenue intake of the government, it tends to have negative impact at growth. Definitely in the short and medium term. In some studies, they have shown that it have led to increases in growth in the longer term. And most of those results come from Asian countries, which have a completely different economic structure to us. So we can't draw a lot of conclusions from their experiences. And they are by and large the only countries that had positive results, as one would anticipate, from exchange rate devaluation and depreciation and so on. So we have to be very careful in terms of the strategy we use for the adjustment. And therefore, I think it is right that the minister put the whole issue of the exchange rate devaluation or depreciation off the table, at least for now. In terms of the increased level of debt, this is kind of unavoidable. If you look across the global economy, the debt levels of almost every country has gone up significantly since the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. And even before that, a number of countries were still battling with the vestiges of the fallout from the 2007-2008 international financial crisis. So many countries, they have seen their debt levels skyrocket in some cases. But this is unavoidable in the context that if you were to do otherwise and not borrow, the economic consequences of not borrowing was going to be even more deleterious than if you borrowed. So basically, policymakers had a choice between the devil and the deep blue sea, and you basically they chose the deep blue sea, because what borrowing does is allows you to buy time to make more fundamental changes without crashing the economy than one would have to do if borrowing wasn't available. So total debt levels in Trinidad and Tobago is obviously above the 60% benchmarks that many economists feel is the threshold beyond which economy shouldn't go. But given the context in which we are operating today, I think that there is no choice that the Minister of Finance has to borrow to sustain economic activity, so that when the pandemic is over, the economic system, economic actors, the supply chains and so on could quickly get charged up to exploit all the opportunities that will become available in the as the global economy recovers and so on. To do otherwise will cause some parts of the economy to atrophy. We are already hearing about supply changes, supply chains that have been disrupted, right? There are many businesses that are likely to fail in the current environment and are unlikely to recover and be there for when the pandemic eventually eases. So the onus is already on the government to try to maintain and sustain as much of that economic activity as is possible, so that we could take advantage of the recovery. And we don't want to basically dig a hole that is so large that it will take us more than a decade to climb out of before we could start growing again, right? That is essentially what happened to the Jamaicans, right? Right, thank you very much, right? So I think I'm running out of time, so I'm going to get to some of the specific recommendations. Some advice to the minister. Some of what he's done is okay, but he has also, there are some areas where he could go further. So for example, he has done some things to try to reduce the imported durables, except plant and machinery. But he needs to go further in terms of, I think, having a graduated tax regime that that restricts certain types of imports rather than quotas, because you're going to run into problems with quotas because you have to be WTO compliant. Very importantly, there's a FX fee for foreign exchange purchases. Barbados have already implemented one as a 2%. Anytime you make a foreign exchange purchase, you have to pay 2% on the value of your purchase. Now, no, this is not on foreign exchange sales. So you are trying to limit purchase, but not curtail sales to the market, which is what you want if you want to equilibrate the foreign exchange market. You also need to make some major reforms to the microstructure of the foreign exchange market. This is an area that I've studied in detail to encourage lower costs and increase the liquidity in the market. Or very importantly as well, you have to increase interest rates on TT-denominated securities to restrain the substitution of TT dollars into US dollar denominated assets, which has put a lot of strain on the exchange rate in Trinidad and Tobago and contributed to the imbalances. And of course, Professor Watson talked about the need to expand the agricultural sector. The minister has done something in terms of 500 million. I think he needs to go further. In terms of fiscal and debt policy, the maintenance of foreign exchange liquidity is very important during the pandemic. Therefore, the use of low-cost development financing options, such as the IMF's new short-term liquidity line, should be used to bolster reserve. And of course, fiscal adjustment must focus on revenue, rising revenue rather than expenditure efficiency rather than expenditure cut. And last but by no means least, as Professor Watson closed, you need longer-term policy adjustment to incentivize local production on a whole range of low-tech light manufacturing products to lower our import intensity and FX demand, because our import intensity is about 80% and above. In some Caribbean countries, it's over 90%, and that is the heart of the imbalances that we see in the foreign exchange market, which is one of our biggest development challenges. And I would like to stop there and, of course, invite Dr. Arjoon to begin his presentation. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us, attendees, and we invite you to continue to keep sending your comments and questions. So we'll now take in Vaalmikki's Dr. Arjoon's presentation.
All right, can everyone hear me properly?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so let's first begin by looking at exactly where we are at now. Now, we, of course, all understand that we're in a very precarious economic position, a very dangerous economic position, as a matter of fact. So you're looking at well over 10 years of fiscal deficits, consecutive fiscal deficits. In fact, over that period, we would have spent about 59 billion more than what we actually earned in revenue. So, of course, we didn't save any sort of money. The only savings we really have to fall back on really is the Heritage and Stabilization Fund. So because we didn't save, our debt to GDP ratio went up from 50.6 to 72%, where it's at right now. And we're likely to see it increase, according to the minister, to about 77% by the end of next year. And my estimations will bring it to about 83% by the latter part of next year. Credit rating from Moody's, we went from investment grade back in 2016 to now being in the speculative or the junk status at BA1 negative, the negative aspect there, and a sign that we will probably be downgraded again in the coming year. And of course, our ease of doing business continues to languish. It's very difficult to do business in Trinidad. We're at 105th position. And of course, if it is difficult to do business in your country, foreign investors are not really going to want to invest here, would they? So as a result, foreign investors are actually pulling out of the economy, as we're seeing here, by these negative FDI values, being a high of 701.87 million in 2018. Our foreign reserves now stand at about 7.44 billion. But what we have to understand is that this is more or less artificially pushed up, because when we borrow from abroad, when we issue, for example, that $500 million US bond that we did some months ago, that money you can't spend it in US and Trinidad and Tobago. You have to convert it to TT. So when the central bank converts that money goes into the foreign reserve account. So it artificially props up the foreign reserve account. Same thing with the Heritage and Stabilization Fund. When they convert the US into TT, and it props up the reserve fund, now standing at 7.4 billion. Now, before we go on, I just want to take a quick look at his revenue projections. The minister suggested that they're expecting a revenue of about $41 billion this year. But I think, pragmatically speaking, that's a bit of an overstatement, because 68% of their revenue collections come from taxes. And out of this tax revenue, they expect about 60%, the vast majority, to be from taxes on income and profits. Now, if you look at this table here, from 2014 to fiscal 2014, that is, to fiscal 2021, we would see that there was a high of 36.7 billion in taxes on income and profits collected, which was of course largely because energy prices and production were in our favor back then. In 2020, fiscal 2020 that just went by, it's down to 15 billion dollars. But then when you consider that many SMEs, I would put it in the hundreds, perhaps even the thousands of SMEs, are actually out of business right now. And I think Dave may have mentioned earlier that a lot of them are probably out of doing business permanently. This of course means that if you're not in operation, then you're not going to be paying taxes on your profits. So if you're not making profits, then you don't pay taxes at all. Because, and the other thing we have to remember is the concept of tax losses being carried forward to the next year. So even if in the next year you would be you're making some profits, you would deduct your tax losses carried forward and end up paying less taxes. The government would end up collecting less taxes. So overall, I still believe that this 16.6 billion that he identified from taxes on income and profits to still be overstated. And not only that, remember that with the closure of many elements of the private sector and the loss-making states of many elements of the private sector, tens of thousands of persons are now out of jobs. In fact, I remember looking at an IDB study some time ago where they did a survey and identified that about 68% of low-income households were affected by job losses, and then 49% of the middle-income households were affected, and as well as 23% of the high-income households would have been affected by job losses as well. Now, apart from them not being able to pay income tax, this is a serious loss of purchasing power, because if you have less purchasing power, it means you're not really going to go out there, your household is not really going to go out there and spend this money for the private sector to benefit. So companies' earnings, those that are still in existence, is going to fall. When their earnings fall, it means the government is going to collect less tax revenue. So I would think that this 16.6 billion, even though it's low relative to where we were at before, in the last 5 years, it was an average of about 19 billion per year. I believe that this is still a bit overstated, perhaps by about $1.5 to $2 billion. Now, one of the issues that he raised in this budget, and one of the initiatives that he's embarking on, is removing the concessions on car purchases. For example, concessions on importing small engines, hybrid vehicles, CNG type vehicles, etc. Now, the reason touted by the minister for doing this is because of the vast amount of foreign exchange that the automotive sector tends to use. But then that brings the question, is really cutting the demand for foreign exchange by the consumer and small businesses the best way to alleviate our foreign exchange woes? Because to me, it seems like just another easy way out mechanism that the state is trying to use in order to conserve whatever foreign exchange they have. And if we look at this table here, we would see that from 2017 to 2019, in each quarter, in most of the quarters actually, foreign exchange, the automotive sector, car dealers in the automotive sector, they would have faced, especially in 2017, some significant declines in their sales. And this is before this measure was actually introduced. Remember, back then, in the pre-COVID period, demand was already low. We were already in a recession. So sales levels were already low in the first place. Income levels would have already fallen because of several job losses. And then they would have been besieged not only by a higher cost of doing business, but also by higher corporation taxes. So these companies were already struggling back then. And now to go and levy this particular measure is going to cause some serious strain in the automotive industry, especially for used cars dealers. And as again, I reiterate, as you see here, their sales were basically in a decline for each quarter from 2017, for most of the quarters for 2017 to 2019. Now, we have to ask ourselves, okay, you want to cut the demand for foreign exchange and increase the supply of foreign exchange. When thinking about it pragmatically, if you cut the demand for foreign exchange, at the same time, you're basically going to severely hurt what is basically a big industry, in retail industry in Trinidad and Tobago, which is the the automotive sector, more particularly the foreign used car dealers. And one of the things that I think the government needs to start looking at is to start seriously plugging the outflows or the leakages of US from our system. And that brings me to illicit financial flows. Over 2008, and I know the United Nations has actually started speaking about this more rigorously and aggressively recently. Over 2008 to 2017, we would have lost an average of over 4.1 billion US dollars. Now understand this figure. This is on average each year. We're losing 4.1 billion US dollars from trade misinvoicing. And what is trade misinvoicing? So for example, when some exporters under invoice, that's where they would deliberately understate the prices of the goods that they're exporting as a mechanism to pay less taxes and to go and hide profits offshore. So if the correct value that should be on the invoice when you're exporting is about 100,000, but the invoice actually says 75,000, that would mean a leakage of an addition of about 25,000 that just goes unaccounted for and would sit in an account in a foreign country, when that same 25,000 US dollars could in fact be used more productively locally here. And then you have the other instance, the opposite side of the coin, where some others may over-invoice on imports as a way to launder the proceeds of criminal activities. Now, this 4.1 billion US dollars, that represents, when you convert it to TT, that's about 56% of our national budget. So clearly, plugging this hole, this leakage in our foreign exchange, could go a very long way in easing the availability of foreign exchange to the private sector. And we could avoid things where we have to stymie the activities of various sectors in order to provide where the income in those sectors provide bread or roti or whatever you want to call it for various households, the table for various households each month, because these sectors, these retail sectors, including the automotive sector, they do account for a large segment of employment in the private sector. So I just want to quickly take a look at agriculture, because agriculture is touted to be one of the major focuses of the state this year forward. Agriculture, to me, has always appeared to be the unwanted stepchild of the economy. That's the way they treat the sector. Now, as we see here, and that shows basically from the budgetary allocations over the last few years, from fiscal 2016 now to fiscal 2021. So far, agriculture really contributes about, on average each year, about a meager 1.12% to GDP, employing just about 3% of your workforce. And this year we're seeing now there's an allocation of just about 2% of the government expenditure, of state expenditure on agriculture. Now, we hear a lot about the food import bill. Let's take a look at the figures here. When we spend each year, we import each year just on average about just over $6.1 billion on food items, but we export about somewhere around the vicinity of about 2.5 to 2.6 billion each year, which leaves a deficit of about 3.5 to 3.7 billion on average each year. So this is woeful performance. Now, Professor Watson indicated earlier that we're never going to really achieve this 100% food security and self-sufficiency when it comes to food. And I'm inclined to agree with him as well. But of course, we need to take the certain measures, and I think putting more money in the agriculture sector is not the only thing that is required. There are more bottlenecks than in doing business in the agriculture sector that we need to fix. Right now, agricultural land in the country is about 54,000 hectare acres. That is down from 81,000 in 1991. But there are other key problems in the agriculture sector, for example, inadequate labor supply. When we introduced GATE and dollar for dollar back in the day, and many more people could have access to tertiary education, they started to turn away from agriculture opportunities because there was more of a demand. They figured, well, we're getting free tertiary education now, so there's a demand for high-skilled jobs. Not that I disagree with dollar for dollar or GATE. I mean, I was one of those who benefited from it. But one solution to this, create an agriculture work permit program for Venezuelans that are wishing to work in TNT. If we cannot find reliable labor from our local workforce, then we could look to the Venezuelan economic migrants for that workforce. And this is not something new. This idea has been around for quite a few months. And other problems, pre-deal larceny. Pre-deal larceny, even though again the minister mentioned it in a higher charge for that in this particular budget, but the problem is really the pre-deal larceny unit in itself is understaffed. And then of course there are infrastructural issues in the agriculture sector, for example, irrigation issues. Only about 6.7% of the land is actually irrigation equipped. Drainage problems in order to access proper warehousing and post-harvest facilities. These are all problems that stymie our agricultural production. And then of course you have the big one, land tenure. If you don't have land tenure, no matter how much money you pump into the agriculture ministry, how much incentives they provide, you cannot access them because you don't have land tenure. Only if you have land tenure, then you're allowed to go and get these grants, these educational programs, have these tax and duties exemptions, etc. And on the note of taxes, the minister, on 2 budgets, this one and the last one, he would have touted that the agriculture sector is virtually tax-free. Well, it's not tax-free. You still have to pay VAT. You still have to pay corporation taxes. It is not a tax-free sector at the end of the day. And then we can look to also fishing. We can't forget fishing as well. In 2016, we would have given a warning. We would have been yellow carded by the European Union for illegal and unregulated fishing activities. Then you have piracy being still prevalent in the region, with little security being offered to our fishermen. The Toko port, however, that is something that they've suggested, apart from the benefits of having a port in Toko and the small businesses that could spring up in the area. One of the other benefits is having enhanced maritime security because of the existence of that port. So we look forward to seeing that happening by 2022, which is when they indicated it is going to be finished, which I highly doubt. Now, one of the key game changers that I believe has been offered in this budget is the Port of Port of Spain. This is something that privatizing this port is something that I've been advocating for the last 2 to 3 years. And I'm very pleased to see that the minister has finally decided to do it. Our port in Port of Spain has not been competitive for many, many years, and the business has been declining. And there are a couple of reasons for this. The first one is that the infrastructure, in terms of the cranes, the trailers, the container lifts, etc., we haven't serviced them for many, many years, and the cost of maintaining them now is actually very high. In fact, the economic life for a lot of these infrastructure is basically gone. Then there are other issues like labor productivity, management efficiency, poor investment and spending decisions, turnaround times, are all deficient. And that would have caused the port to suffer significant loss and to lose clientele to other ports in the region. Now, a big reason we lost clientele and market share is because back in 2014, the Panama Canal would have expanded their port. They would have undergone a major infrastructure work to expand the port, to allow for much larger shipping vessels to come out of Asia through the Panama Canal and into the Latin American region to facilitate more trading activities. So some of these shipping lines, when they use smaller vessels, they would have docked at the Port of Port of Spain. But since we didn't dredge our port, these larger shipping vessels, they call the Panamax and the Supramax vessels, they cannot come to Port of Spain anymore. So they're now going to Jamaica and the Dominican Republic. Now, the reason that they're going to Dominica the Dominican Republic and Jamaica, sorry, is because those ports made the proper infrastructural changes and dredged their ports properly to be able to accommodate these larger shipping vessels. And they were able to do this because they privatized their port. That's a big difference between them and us. When they privatized their ports, they were able to accommodate these shipping vessels, so it went to them. And as a result of this, you can see here that our market share among some of the top ports, or the more important ports within the Latin American and Caribbean region, our market share is right at the bottom of the table, only above Guyana. Okay, Jamaica is in 3rd place, and the Dominican Republic is in 4th place with respect to the market share being the percentage of container throughput that is received in the region. And again, they were able to do this, to achieve this, because when they privatized, they got the necessary capital, the necessary liquidity to be injected into their ports to dredge it properly and fix whatever infrastructure needed fixing. It will cost us 900 million, although I think by now this figure would have gone up, because It was in 2016, they indicated that it will cost 900 million to properly expand our port, dredge it, fix the infrastructure, which should in turn ideally bring back some of our lost market share. Our productivity is woefully low. When you look at the productivity of the TNT port, the productivity is measured by the amount of container moves per hour. We only have 13 per hour, whereas Jamaica is 32, Mexico is 42, and Dominican Republic is 43. In fact, earlier this week, yesterday actually, when I made the same presentation to another group, someone there who is very familiar with the port told me that this figure of 13 is actually an overstated figure, is much worse now. So the container moves per hour are actually quite low. And when your container moves per hour are quite low, it also means, taking aside the factor that we didn't dredge the port properly and the shipping vessels, the larger shipping vessels, aren't really coming here anymore. It also means that those that are coming here may not even want to come any longer, because there will be delays. They will have to stay much longer in order to have the containers offloaded from those shipping vessels. And if there are delays in offloading, then that means that their schedule at the Panama Canal is not being met. Of course, if their schedule is not being met, those delays mean an additional cost to those shipping lines. And it also means that they're at risk of losing their clientele at some point in time. Those individuals that use those particular vessels because they take longer to transport whatever commodities they're transporting. This table here shows the annual container moves for the key ports in the region. And again, we're at the bottom of the table here. For Trinidad and Tobago, it was 520,900 in 2016, down to now, in 2018, the most recent data available, 358,500. Whereas Jamaica went from 1.6 million, 1.7 million in 2016 to 1.8 million approximately in 2018. So their ports are doing much better. Jamaica gets about 80% more container business than the Port of Spain. And again, many shipping lines would go and choose ports like the Kingston Freeport Terminal in order to avoid significant delays and the risk of missing their schedule in the Panama Canal. When this table here now shows the profits, compares the profits with the Port of Spain and the Kingston Freeport Terminal. And as you can see here, I didn't put the 2015 figure, I apologize for that. But in 2015, that would have been the last year, as far as the data goes, the last year that would have given us any sort of positive earnings, positive profits. We would have earned about 353,477 US dollars as profits in 2015. But since then, it just went to a loss-making state. A loss of 3.6 million US in 2016 and 3.7 million US in 2017. But after Kingston privatized their port, they made a profit from about, back in 2015, from about 5.7 million US up to, in 2016 after the privatization, to 24.5 million US. And then that almost doubled in 2017 to 43.5 million US. So the figures show it. We don't have to reinvent the wheel because other countries, they followed this model, like Kingston, like Jamaica, sorry, like Dominican Republic, and the best performing port in the world, Singapore, and in Singapore is a private port as well. So us getting a private operator, I think, is a step in the right direction with respect to improving the efficiencies at the port. However, there's a caveat to that. And after the caveat, I'll end my presentation. Right now, a lot of us who engage in international trade, especially manufacturers, they feel the worst brunt of it. They encounter problems because of customs officials and their poor work ethic and productivity at the port. What's happening because they're not getting sufficient access to foreign exchange still. They started to use whatever little they have to order smaller amounts of raw materials, but at a more regular interval. So as fast as they get the foreign exchange, they would import. But it's of course importing at smaller quantities. But in doing so, it means that they're importing more regularly. So on a more regular basis, they have to face the deficiencies of customs and the port. So when customs official, a simple thing, they don't turn up to work, then you're looking at their items being left at the port for more than the 5-day period. the 5-day rent-free period, and then they have to now go and pay rental charges at the port and incur customs overtime charges as well. So even if you get a private port operator, that port operator will have no jurisdiction to control customs, the work ethic of customs. And this is where the government, the state, needs to actually step in, the Ministry of Trade and Ministry of National Security, and start clamping down on the inefficiencies that are proffered by the customs sector here in TNT. But I think I will just want to end on a positive note. I think a good thing that has been done is establishing this electronic platform where the actual title that the minister indicated was, escapes me right now, but a platform essentially where they can, where traders can submit all their documents online without having to work with hard copies at the port later on, and can actually also make all their payments, whatever taxes and duties and customs charges that they have to make. They can make these payments online as well. It hasn't started as yet, but the minister indicated in the budget that they're hoping to roll this out in due course. I think if it does happen, it's a very positive step because it means getting access to your goods faster, especially for manufacturers. Countries like Jamaica have already implemented it, and Zambia, countries like Zambia are miles ahead of us because they've established this e-customs platform well over 3 years now. So as I conclude, I just want to say is not all doom and gloom here. The economy is in a bad state, but I think with certain key decisions and also paying careful attention to the growth of the SME sector and fixing that ease of doing business as well, we should not remain on a slippery slope for as long as some of us may be fearful of, right? So thank you for your time, and please let me know if you have any questions.
Thank you, gentlemen, for your presentations. It was certainly a joy to listen to them. Thank you, Professor Watson, for taking us through an in-depth look at what is going on with foreign exchange. Interestingly, areas where we think that they are net earners of foreign exchange, they are net users of foreign exchange, which is quite interesting, as we can see, and we'll have some questions about that. Dave, thank you for helping us to understand and appreciate why the government did not use exchange rate adjustments at this point in time, and helping us to understand even better why the increase in debt is unavoidable, and then in fact making the case for more debt, which is not usually what some people may understand. But thank you for that, and thank you, Dr. Arjoon. I know we will have some questions in particular with regards to some of the items you mentioned, which would be some of the illicit flows. That's a substantial amount of losses. That's, you're talking about 56% of the national budget in illicit flows. So we will look forward to hearing some of that. Now, we do have some questions from the audience, and from the audience, we do encourage you to keep posing your questions in the chat box, and remember to send your questions to all panelists and attendees, and we will try to get to all of your questions. We have until 7 o'clock. And we will see how best we can get through as many of those questions that we have posed to us. Now, first question I would, that coming from the audience, we would go to Professor Watson. We have a couple of questions for you, Prof, but we will try to ask them in an order that will stimulate the conversation in that way. Now, you mentioned, now I'm just going to preface it in that one of the areas you identified was that tourism is a possible area where we can earn foreign exchange, but the question is, how do you see, this is for Professor Watson, how do you see the tourism sector earning foreign exchange in light of the COVID-19 pandemic?
Are you hearing me by any chance? Because
yes, I am hearing you. Yes.
Yeah. I am not very hopeful about the tourism sector, especially following COVID. My own feeling is that even in the Caribbean, Barbados has been taking some fairly splendid initiatives. For instance, inviting me to come and live there while working in Trinidad. And that is a way of earning foreign exchange via the tourism sector. So it's a sort of inviting professionals to come and live there while working abroad. And all the cruise industry, on which, for instance, Dominica depends a lot, I cannot imagine that they were one of the main sources of COVID-19. A lot of the users who come to the Caribbean anyway, they look more like me than they do you, Daren, in the sense that they are in the group that is endangered by COVID-19, and they are hardly likely to be picking this up in any major way. So classic tourism, as we are accustomed to it, the hotel tourism is unlikely to work. Now, the island of Trinidad is not a big one for tourism, and it's ready for Tobago. And yet in the case of Tobago's tourism is largely, it's a lot of, I wouldn't say largely because I don't have exact figures before me, but the little that I have tells me that a lot of the tourism to Tobago, in fact, many are now insisting that they open up the sea bridge because they want Trinidadians to come, and that is not foreign exchange earning. If anything, that is foreign exchange using, because the expenditure of the hotels, etc., in foreign exchange will remain, whereas the earnings are not going to be in the form of foreign exchange if they come from Trinidadians. So I really believe that if we are going into tourism, and I don't think anything should be ignored at this point in time, but I do believe that we should be very careful not to go along a path that we have trod so many years before. The conventional tourism, the tourism coming to the sea and sand, and so on, I think that is dead. And if it's not dead, it's likely to be dominated by those who have an absolute and a comparative advantage within the region already. I am speaking about Barbados, Jamaica, Antigua, and Bermuda. There's a report recently of the IDB where they show the dependence on tourism of the various countries in the Caribbean and Latin America. On the top of it is Aruba. I don't know if you've ever been to Aruba, not a very pretty country, but made very beautiful by the tourism sector, and a tourist stay there. It's very enjoyable. Quite on the top of the list as well is the Bahamas and Barbados and Grenada. Trinidad and Tobago, out of 166 countries studied, is 106th. We have a very, very long way to go when it comes to building a tourism capability. There is some advantage in that, I suspect, because we're coming from nowhere, so we could only go upward, and that is true. But it cannot be in areas that are now dominated, let's say, by Aruba and by Antigua and Bermuda. The conventional tourism, which is enjoyed by these countries, we are going to be at a loss. So we have to find novel forms of tourism. Many people have been talking about sport tourism, event tourism, such as Carnival and other things like that. But I want to see more than talk, and I want to see something that is a little bit beyond just emotion. I want to see really, really good studies that will tell me, and plans and projects that will encourage the other forms of tourism, because tourism is one of the biggest industries in the world. It's just that over the years we have ignored it because we have had oil and gas, but that too is disappearing, and it is correct to look in the direction of tourism. But because we are coming from so far behind, we cannot compete with those who are already on that well-trod path. I'm going to stop there, and if you want to ask me to elaborate further, we could talk about it.
All right, thank you very much, Prof, for your response. Now we have the comments coming in. I'm just trying to go through them here. Let me ask this question to Dave. Dr. Seerattan, you close the economy down, you open it back up. In the near future, there should be immediate growth. Thus a stronger case for the V-shaped business cycle range. Do you agree?
Well, the J-curve effect means that you have a response to the devaluation after an initial period when you have growth going down. The problem with that is that even in the long term, I don't see devaluation having the desired impact on growth. So it's definitely not a J-curve. J-curve, as I said before, might be a feature of economies in Asia and so on, who have a competitive export sector based on price, efficiency, and so on. But we don't have that kind of arrangement. We don't have those kinds of industries here in the Caribbean. So I don't think the GF curve is going to operate in Trinidad and Tobago, in the Caribbean generally, and in Trinidad and Tobago specifically, for some of the reasons I mentioned. The fact that much of our energy products are on these long-term contracts, supply contracts with fixed prices and so on.
All right, thank you, Dave. But now can you just tell us if you agree with the case for the V-shaped business cycle, in that they lock the economy down, you open it back up, you're supposed to see a quick and immediate recovery. That's a case for the V-shaped business cycle. Some people argue about the L-shape. So do you agree that we should see a V-shaped business cycle in our system?
Okay, I agree with the people who think that there's going to be a U-shaped recovery. Even the fund that has generated the estimates that suggest a V-shaped recovery is now starting to pitch a narrative that suggests that, given the emergence of second waves and so on, the immediate revival of the economy in 2021 is unlikely to happen. And we have witnessed that ourselves. We were going along very merrily, and then we had this wave that had the economy to shut down and so on. So I think a U-shaped recovery is much more realistic. Most economists believe that this shock, the pandemic, is more impactful in a negative way than the international financial crisis in 2007, 2008. And there are countries in the world today who are still trying to recover from the vestiges of that particular negative shock. And therefore, if we are saying that COVID is going to have a much more impactful and long-lasting impact, then I can't see a V-shaped recovery being possible. What I could think will happen is that you have more like a recovery where it is kind of, it fits and spurts. So for example, you open back up the economy and growth goes back up, and then you need to lock down again as we have had to, and then the growth falls off again. Hopefully, we are going to get a vaccine, and we are going to get other therapeutic approaches to dealing with COVID that will eliminate the negative growth impact of COVID. But it's unlikely that a V-shaped recovery is going to be the state of affairs going forward. It's more like a U-shape.
Right. All right. Thank you, Dr. Seerattan, for that response. Dr. Arjoon, you seem to have presented a compelling case for the privatization of the port, in that some of our attendees are now in agreement that the port should be privatized. The question is, can you tell us about the employment experience after Jamaica and the Dominican Republic privatized their port?
I'm not aware of the Dominican Republic, but I know some workers in Jamaica would have had to be terminated. But in TNT, our experience would most likely, I would think, be one where workers will lose jobs. But I should think that the government, in their negotiations with the private operator, may opt to provide a visa packages to these individuals. What's happening in our ports is that much of the workforce, and the port is overstaffed. They've been overstaffed for quite a long time. But much of this workforce are people who are actually close to the retirement age. And the problem is that they don't have any sort of a recruitment, a proper formal recruitment program, and a proper formalized training program as well. So I think that a private operator, I would hope that a private operator coming on stream would offer this type of a program then, and but in addition to that, offer some of these workers, especially given that the port is highly overstaffed, not just send them home, of course, but give them a very attractive visa package. The private operator ideally should be able to afford to do this. I anticipate is going to be a foreign operator. In fact, given that the minister indicated that he wants this done by the end of this fiscal year, I am suspicious that they probably have one in mind already, that they perhaps, you never know, one can speculate that they that they've been in this discussion for a while, and that they have this sources operator. So I would imagine I would assume it's probably from China, although I would have hoped to see someone from a company from Singapore being the individual, the company that runs our port, given that the best performing port in the world is in Singapore. But nonetheless, I should think that yes, there will be some separation packages hopefully being offered to the workers, the overstaffed workers that is in the port.
All right, continuing along, thank you, Dr. Arjoon, for that response. Continuing along with the discussion on the port, Professor Watson, why do you think it took them so long to privatize the port is the question directed to you. And in addition to which, why do they wait until the budget to make decisions rather than make the decisions when they need to be made?
In all honesty, the privatization of the port, clearly Vaalmikki has given this a lot of thought, but politicians are not the most, the easiest people to respond to a problem. If you know the history of the port in Trinidad and Tobago, going back from one of the biggest strikes we have had in 1919, emanated on the port, and in fact there was a large impetus to the development of the working class in Trinidad and trade unionism in Trinidad and Tobago. And in the early days of the PNM, a lot of the support came from the port. You had and that has continued right up to today. It is the port is closely linked. And many of the heads of the ports have sat in parliament as senators, both government and independent senators. So it's not something that they would have probably done with a great amount of joy. And I like the question that you just posed, what is going to happen to the labor? Because I have already seen the current head of the Seamen and Waterfront Workers Trade Union asking that very question, what is going to happen, or expressing concern about it to the people there. And indeed, it cannot be done without some difficulty. What is typical of many governments, and that includes the government of Trinidad and Tobago, is they respond, and this budget is typical of a lot of that. They wait until a crisis is upon us to respond. They are responding like that, where where the business of the subsidies on the oil are concerned, and they are responding to it on it. I don't think that much thought was given to it. It's not in any manifesto or whatsoever. That is certainly something that has come. Maybe some of the information that Vaalmikki has about the Jamaican port, which I found very interesting, by the way, is something that came on the desk of the minister, on the desk of the Ministry of Transport and so on, and they are working at it. So I really cannot explain why they took so long, except to say that it is not untypical for governments to respond in extreme urgency when things become extremely urgent.
Can I just weigh on that as well, to add to what Professor Watson said? In addition to the urgency of it, I mean, the state cannot afford to finance some of the activities as at the port, and they've been asking for a lot of money for subventions for quite some time. But in addition to that, the port they have a very tight union presence, and we have to consider whether or not politicians, and I would think that they didn't, whether they in the past had the political will to go and take this step to privatize the port, knowing fully well that it may have some repercussions with the unions as well.
All right, thank you. And some people may say, well, if you advocate for privatizing the port, why stop there? Let's go ahead and sell off all state enterprises. But that's a different discussion, so let's hold on that. Let's turn our attention now to agriculture. While you have the floor, Dr. Arjoon, why does agriculture get the lowest allocation when we are aiming for food security?
Well, it gets the lowest allocation because for the obvious reason is because for several decades, we've been reaping extraordinary economic rents from the oil and gas sector. And agriculture, there's also a cultural aspect of agriculture. I mean, the reality is that many persons tend to look down on the sector for some reason or the other. As I mentioned in my presentation, is regarded largely as the unwanted stepchild of the economy. When I mean, really and truly, if you have such a very high food import bill every year, I would also go as far as to say that can we really truly consider ourselves as an independent nation when we rely so heavily on the world to feed us? Now, I agree, we will probably not achieve 100% food security, but at least we could bring it to some sort of an acceptable level. 6 billion is way too much. So I think that having quality, you see, what I've seen in my few years of looking on at what happens in Parliament and following the budgets, etc., is that we have a 5-year mentality, and we try to achieve as much as we can as quickly as possible. So when we have these massive oil and gas rents, what you'd find is that the allocations and the more so the attention being paid to the agriculture sector starts to drop, right? But then when there's less oil and gas revenues happening in the country as it is right now, at some point in time you would see a very slight or marginal increase in the allocations to agriculture. But I think the primary reason why it's being seen as why it's being treated in this particular manner, one, it doesn't really add much to the GDP relative to the other sectors, like manufacturing is between usually 18% of the GDP. And then of course, the massive amounts of oil and gas, the hydrocarbon sector tends to contribute. It doesn't contribute much to the GDP. Then some may figure, well, why bother to invest much in it at all? And why bother to fix the bottlenecks within the sector at all?
Daren, let me just say another word I want to add to this. Agriculture is...
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. Agriculture is and has always been the bastard child. That is true. And in fact, any minister, anybody looking for a post in the government, it's a punishment to give them the Ministry of Agriculture. It has never been treated with any respect, and its lip service is all that they get. But let me say something on this food security business. One of the reasons why the import bill is so high is relative to our foreign exchange earning capacity elsewhere. I see no problem in buying goods, agricultural goods, especially from the Caribbean region, if they are so much better. It's, in a way, it's the whole argument of comparative and absolute advantage. And to the extent that they can make it better than us, they can make it cheaper than us, we can have a stock. And it is time, if they keep talking about this food security like they do about import cover. Is it that you want us to have enough food to last for 3 months, for 6 months? What it is you want to have in this measure of food security? One of the things missing from the discussion for here, and because it's probably not something that comes up in the budget, is the completion of the CARICOM project, which will make agriculture a CARICOM issue and not just a Trinidad and Tobago issue. Thanks, Ray.
Thank you, Professor Watson. As a matter of fact, there was a request for you to comment on your views as to whether or not you would consider the agricultural sector to be as foreign. The question is phrased, but I believe the person meant as intensive in terms of foreign exchange users as the manufacturing sector. If you can comment on that.
Well, a lot of the input into agriculture, let's say things like fertilizers, tractors, all these things are foreign, require expenditure. And a lot of people ignore the foreign inputs into agriculture. To the extent that we are not agriculturally inclined, in the sense that we are not as advanced as, let's say, St. Vincent or Grenada is. When I go to the market, I get offers from this is no Trini yam, you know, this is Vinci yam. That's what they tell me, and there's a certain amount of pride that they tell me that. And indeed, if you see the Trini yam compared to the Vinci, there is no comparison between the two, and that is why we go for there is and we have a long way to go. I agree to that we could try and go to that. And even in the area of marijuana, when you're talking about, we are way behind, because that is going to be a normal part of the agricultural sector very soon. We are way behind based on what smokers tell me, people who know the quality of the product, behind St. Vincent and Jamaica in particular in the Caribbean. So yes, we can grow it, but can we compete with it? That's a completely different question. And for all you know, the Trini users of marijuana, both medicinal and the pleasure seekers, let's call them that, they will probably prefer to import the marijuana. Now, what you need in order to ensure that you can afford these things is to get the wherewithal to do so and export whatever good or service that you have that advantage in. At the moment, it's oil, and oil allows us to do that. But to the extent that you can build something else that can provide you with the foreign exchange, yes, build the agricultural sector if this food security matter is so important. But do not count on it, because it can be a very expensive alternative. And as I say, if you build the CARICOM project, and if you rationalize and make the CARICOM single market and economy a reality, we are going to solve to a large extent some of these agricultural issues, because there's a surplus of agricultural production in CARICOM countries like Ghana, and that we can easily absorb into our system. In the United States, or India for that matter, any one state in India or any one state in the United States is not required to be self-sufficient in agriculture, but India is self-sufficient in agriculture. India grows nearly anything you can imagine. They have the size to do it, so you can get strawberries, you can get what we call here Irish potatoes. All of these things are available because there's the size. We don't have that capability, in my view, to approach anything resembling food security, and we certainly will continue to need foreign inputs into it. Whatever the outcome, we are going to have to find, as far as I could hear, all the arguments about agriculture and foreign exchange earning is really foreign exchange saving. Eh? And I am yet to see a convincing argument to that effect. It's based on a presumption that the 6 million you see is a 6 million net. And we don't know if it could be more if we should start going in the wrong direction. So yes, let's go, because nothing is off the table. Eh? Nothing is off the table. Let us see what we can do, but do not count on it as if it's a fait accompli. And that's all I'm saying. What appears to be low-hanging fruit may not, in fact, be so low-hanging, and in fact may take you into serious difficulties if you make the wrong analysis and carry out the wrong policies as a consequence.
Right. Thank you very much, Professor Watson, for that very in-depth response. To the audience, we have about 13 or 14 more minutes. So when I ask these questions now of the panelists, I'd ask that we keep our responses as succinct as possible. I know we're all au courant with the different outcomes and the responses to the different initiatives highlighted in the budget, and we would like to expand on those. And of course, we'll probably need to look at having another session. But Dave, turning our attention to the financial side of things, why are policyholders averse to financing if monies inevitably produce a marketable asset, absent financing for perishable consumptions that do not exhibit high margins? Dave, that's definitely for you.
It's very difficult to kind of figure out what the person is speaking about. What I could say in terms of the financial sector and the impact on the financial sector, most of these studies that have been done in the Caribbean generally and in Trinidad and Tobago in particular says that the financial system is relatively strong and healthy. A lot of these central banks have been doing stress tests to see whether adverse events like COVID-19 could actually jeopardize the stability of the financial system. And in most cases, it has shown that the system is relatively resilient. In terms of how the financial system can help the country move forward, I think we have to begin being a little more, taking a little more risk, because if one has been following the financial system in Trinidad and Tobago over a long period of time. For too often, you know, financial institutions could make a lot of money without necessarily taking risk. And by taking risk, I'm not talking about taking unmitigated risk. I'm talking about taking risk in sectors, for example, that traditionally are not as stable as some of the more traditional sectors. So in entertainment, even in tourism, in agriculture and so on, we really haven't had the kind of traction from the traditional financial services sector in terms of trying to provide financing and advice, because financial institutions also provide some level of advice in terms of how businesses can manage their financial affairs and so on. And that is an area that I think we need to pay some attention to, either by the government creating windows and subsidizing windows in these financial institutions for specific sectors and so on, or by developing special purpose institutions like we have done in agriculture and in some other areas. But these institutions, these special purpose institutions, tend not to be large enough to provide the kind of financial financing that is required to get this giant leap forward in some of these non-traditional sectors. So I think the powers that be have to start to think more carefully about what can be done to get that less risk-averse approach from our financial institutions.
All right, thank you very much, Dave, for that response. Now let's just briefly take a turn back to look at agriculture before we get into the very controversial sale of the NP stations, gas stations. Professor Watson, this is coming from Prof. Theodore. With the looking at the intention to take the sector to a much higher technological level, do you think that that is a game changer, Professor Watson?
I didn't hear the first part about it, something about the gas.
Given that in agriculture, given that the express intention is to take the sector to a much higher technological level,
yes,
do you see this as a game changer in the agriculture?
Well, if it happens, if it does happen, you see, one of the problems with governments and budget statements, I mean, is we never get an accounting of what has happened over the year in any meaningful way. To the extent that you are now going in you plan to raise the level of it, I cannot imagine that will not be beneficial. But let's take, for instance, the labor that may be required. One member of the panel, I think was Vaalmikki, mentioned the use of Venezuelans. Some of these Venezuelans are not interested in going into agriculture. Some of them are highly trained there in the sense, at least at the level, they may have the equivalent of A levels and so on. And they're looking for jobs and so on that will suit their qualifications. They don't have an experience in agriculture, but the kinds of persons that are involved in the agricultural sector, usually, they are now taken up by CPEP. CPEP outprices the agricultural sector when it comes to that. Are we going to go in the direction of easing up on CPEP to make sure that the kinds of workers we want to enter into the agriculture system are available? If that does not happen, we are going to be asking, we are going to be barking up the wrong tree. And it is almost a truism to say that if you raise the technology, you provide tractors, and you train them in using, and you make the land spaces bigger, and you facilitate access roads, and you do all these kinds of things, which is a lot to be done. You hear the perennial concerns of, are you going to overcome all these problems that have caused agriculture to be where it is at this point in time? Because we are way, way, way behind. We are, as I say, compared to the productivity, the production of countries that are close to us, St. Vincent, Grenada, Jamaica, which are the three biggest, and of course, Guyana. How do we get to that point where we can compete with these? How do we do that? That is going to be a hell of an effort. All I see when the minister spoke about agriculture and some of the technological efforts that he's going to, he did not mention the premier agricultural institution for training in the country, which is the Faculty of Agriculture at the University of the West Indies. He spoke to the University of Trinidad and Tobago. When we started as a university, we were the Imperial College of Tropical Agriculture, which was the place where the British trained people for all tropical, and it was a very, very prestigious institution. People from France, people from the French colonies as well choose to come to Trinidad and Tobago for training. What has happened since then? All the graduates of the faculty, first of all, I sit from a position, I know I'm talking about, agriculture is one of the faculty, the least demanded faculty on campus, and I'm sure that still is the case. And the graduates of them, they're looking for a job in the Ministry of Agriculture. They're not looking to go into farming or anything like that. That is the reality. Why is that? That is not because they are wicked and so on. And when that continues, we will continue to have the 1 to 4% contribution of the agriculture sector to bring it up to a level that will encourage people to go into it willingly, to bring that production in a growing economy with agriculture taking a bigger share in the system. You're going to have to do certain things that you're going to have to perform a miracle in the agricultural sector. Let me just say one last thing on this. You check where agriculture is strong. Agriculture is strongest in countries that are very industrialized. The United States of America is an example. France is an example. Many countries of Europe are examples. There is a myth to think that the development of the modern sector is in contradiction with the development of the agricultural sector. My own feeling is we should concentrate more on building the bigger, the stronger, the strongest, where we can find comparative and absolute advantage even, and go for that. And as I said in my presentation, the product that we are wanting to find may not even be on the radar at this point in time.
Thank you very much, Prof. Thank you very much. Now let me pass these questions off to Dave. Dave, let me ask you this question. One of the questions that came in is with regards to the price of fuel. That is, the Minister of Finance said the price of fuel is not going to change much with the disposal of NP's assets. What mechanism is there in place to prevent collusion among gas stations to increase prices?
Well, as the minister indicated, both for super and premium gasoline, because of the low price of oil internationally, the subsidy doesn't kick in. So the price that you pay now is essentially the market price. Now, if you have a situation where it's only private people involved, business people involved in the sale of gas, then I think government cannot absorb this from some kind of control in that sector. So, for example, you have to have some kind of quality control in terms of the octane level for gasoline. So, for example, most countries have some kind of standards in terms of the octane level. So, you can't be selling somebody super gasoline, which has an octane level of about 91, and passing it off as premium, which has an octane level of 95. So the government still retains some residual regulatory power in terms of control over the sector. And very importantly, the National Petroleum will still be the entity importing and or producing fuel as the wholesaler. So the government, through that institution, does have some power in terms of control of price gouging, for example. But the biggest preventative measure against that is actually competition. There are a lot of gas stations all over Trinidad and Tobago, and you could be very sure that word will get along that which gas station has the lowest prices and so on. In the US, some people actually drive around a couple of areas actually to find stations that may have the lowest gas prices at a particular point in time. But I think that combination of NP still being around, the government still having some residual regulatory powers in terms of the standards for gasoline and so on, as well as competitive forces, is really going to prevent this price gouging as a possibility.
Don't go yet, Dave. Don't go yet. The question coming in for you now is, you expressed concern about the government's revenue estimates. Do you have concerns or reservations about the expenditures, whether or not they may have been underestimated?
Well, the revenue estimates are always pretty poor in Caribbean countries generally, and in Trinidad and Tobago in particular. The IMF has spent a lot of resources trying to improve the way in which countries in the region generates revenue estimates and so on. And there have been improvements. The estimates for expenditure tend to be much more efficient for obvious reasons. But in the context where we are living in now in terms of the pandemic and the level of uncertainty, if things take a turn for the worse, the government will have to intervene with exceptional expenditure item to, for example, provide liquidity support for businesses and individuals who may be impacted by other COVID or lockdown related expenditures. So I think in the short term, it will be wise for the Minister of Finance to have some contingency financing mechanism available to be able to tap into this thing. And of course, if needs be, the Minister of Finance could always come with a supplementary request to the Parliament for extra money. But I think that is a very good question, because in this environment where there's so much uncertainty and where the government is taking such a important role in how the economy functions, it will be foolhardy not to have a backup plan or a plan B in terms of extra financing.
Thank you very much, Dave. So, ladies and gentlemen, there we have it. We have heard from the experts in terms of their views on the budget. I know we have some more questions. Time is upon us. And so we would like to thank you all for, before we close out, we thank you all for taking the time to come out to join us virtually. But before we sign out, I would like, in the order that we started, starting with Professor Watson, then followed by Dave, and then finally closing out with Dr. Arjoon, in about 2 minutes, gentlemen, each of you, I give you 2 minutes each to give us your closing comments. Professor Watson.
Yeah, okay, thank you very much, Daren. I am hoping that a lot of these measures work because they are necessary to work. The COVID-19 situation is not going to help us much. I am not convinced that it is responsible for the grave among all the ills that we are talking about. I think we were heading down the road to hell for a long time now, and COVID has simply hastened our demise. I am hoping that in the meanwhile, because necessity also is the mother of invention, that our minds in this, our creative juices get to work so that we can develop, and the government is there. I am seeing, and that is one of the areas that is lacking in the budget. Encouragement to people involved in innovative activity, the financing of innovation, and so on, rather than the government identifying and trying to develop some sectors that may or may not be valid. These sectors have been with us for many years. There has always been talk about agriculture. The manufacturing sector has been favored for countless years and have not delivered on the foreign exchange capability. And yet we turn to these the tourism sector as well. We turn to these very sectors to get us out of this mess. Go ahead and try. That is the correct thing to do. But think way beyond that. As we say, as I did the Drucker citation that I gave, we must stop thinking like we did yesterday if we want to go forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Prof. Dave, 2 minutes. Your closing comments.
Okay. The most important thing to me is that although the Minister of Finance has been doing an okay job in terms of public financial management, the government has to really up its game in terms of public financial management. And in particular, this whole issue with VAT refund should never have arisen, because VAT, the kind of uncertainty that generates in especially the SME sector, is a serious restraint on growth. And this happened before COVID-19. So going forward, that should not be a problem hanging over the business sector in Trinidad and Tobago. Secondly, focusing on the foreign exchange market and policies to restrain some balance without necessarily changing the exchange rate has to be the focus of the government. And I only reference about 2 policies that could be implemented off the bat to bring some balance to the foreign exchange market without creating the instability and speculation related to exchange rate changes. And the government has to spend, and the Minister of Finance and the Central Bank have to spend much more time teasing out these very policy. And lastly, but by no means least, is this whole issue of import intensity. The structural problems and all the policy-related outcomes and the negative outcomes in terms of economic outcomes that has happened over long periods of time is because of the import intensity in Trinidad and Tobago. At present, it is over 80%. We are not going to make any headway in any of the areas we talked about, whether it is in the foreign exchange market or in public financial management, if we can't bring that import intensity down. And that has to do with some of the things we talk about in the agriculture sector, but it has to do as well with many other sectors, light manufacturing in particular, and a whole range of services that we import that we don't necessarily have to. Nobody said we're going to be self-sufficient, but the level of dependency that we have on imported inputs, whether they be services, light manufacturing, or agricultural products, is way too high for a country like Trinidad and Tobago, right? And we need to do better in those areas.
Thank you, Dave. Vaalmikki, 1 minute, 59 seconds. Vaalmikki, your mic is muted.
Hello, can you hear me?
Go ahead.
I think the first of all, one of the key messages out there being put out needs to change. We've been hearing it for years, that we have to tighten our belt, burn your belly, etc. Right? Because times are hard. And okay, yeah, the fine is fine with that, but we also need to hear the message that, look, if we got used to a particular lifestyle, a very nice lifestyle, and we want to upkeep it or maybe even better, we need to work for it. We need to change the way we do things and establish more growth, especially within the non-energy sectors, more job creation and export competitiveness in the non-energy sectors, and work in order to upkeep the lifestyle that we've grown so accustomed to, or maybe even work to better it. Okay, I think that needs to also be a message propounded by those in charge of our nation. The other thing that I find quite concerning is that right now we have $12 billion in excess liquidity sitting in the financial system, not being used, money just sitting there idly. That is $12 billion that could be put to some sort of productive use to build productive capacity and to finance a lot of growth initiatives, many of the things that we spoke about here in today's forum, right? So I think going forward, the state, the Ministry of Finance, and the banks, etc., need to start thinking very carefully about what exactly is the problem. Why is this money still stuck in the institutions and not getting into the hands of those who would put it to the most productive use, especially more so the SMEs? Yes, they have to adhere to certain tight regulations, etc. But I mean, the money is there, it's just sitting there doing nothing. The other thing with respect to the budget, I want to start seeing more attention being paid to the financial services market. For example, the stock exchange and the International Financial Center. You have other countries in the world, look at Dubai and Hong Kong, where literally thousands of firms exist in their International Financial Center. And ours is a very embryonic stages. This is another key avenue to generate foreign exchange for the country and diversify the economy. This could very well end up to become another game changer for the country if we have some sort of a policy to make it happen. So I want to start seeing. I know there are people from the Ministry of Finance here as well in this in the audience. So I hope they take this this comment seriously and take it to the minister as well for serious consideration.
And there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much, panelists. I know I am joined by all of the attendees and saying thank you to you all for taking your time to share your knowledge with us and your evaluation of the 2021 budget. We do thank you again for all of the thoughts that we had, and we do thank you for answering the questions. The audience, we thank you for engaging by asking these thought-provoking questions. We may not have gotten to all of you in terms of a response to the questions that you have, but fear not, We have coming up on our slate agenda in November from the 25th through the 27th. We will have a modified version of the conference on the economy, and we will get to some of these questions. We will be exploring the theme, Crisis is Opportunity, COVID-19, the way forward. So we will have heard some of what the issues are in the budget. We will explore them even further in that conference, modified version of the virtual Conference on the Economy 2020. Again, thank you all for joining us. We do wish you all a very safe evening. Remember, continue to observe the government's public health guidelines. Stay safe, and we will all be able to meet once again. We look forward to your participation in our court, and of course, looking forward to our ongoing discussion where budget matters are concerned. Thank you once again. Ladies and gentlemen, good night.